I'm getting ready to tell something.
So for me, I always like to look to the past, and for me, the touchstone is Mayan calendar prophecy, which most people say, "Oh, that's so 2012." It's just December 21st, 2012 came, went. McDonald's is still open. Forget about it. What's next? What's next? We're we always want something new, and I think it's really important that the fundamental question about this prophecy that nobody was talking about, which is everybody knows when it ends, right? December 21st, 2012. But the immediate question that the historian or the inquiring mind should ask, when did it begin? What exactly are we talking? Are we talking about a half an hour period, an hour, 100 years, 500 years? And so what's really interesting is the starting year was 3100 BC.
How do we know that?
Because that's the Mayan calendar. It is measuring a cycle of 5,200 years, 3100 BC to 2012. So the 2012 part is the end part of the calendar. It's like, how do we know the calendar begins on January 1st, right? We're all focusing on December 31st, but if you just go back in the calendar to the beginning of it, it's like, oh, this was 3,100 years ago. 3,100 years ago, not, to my knowledge, a particularly significant date in Central America. But if you step back and look at the planet, holy moly, that is one of the biggest dates in human history, because that's when the first pyramids were built, when the first writing happened, when the first kings and armies, the beginning of patriarchy, the beginning basically of the template of life as we know it today, right? Every single one of us works in a pyramidal structure. I work in several of them. Every organization we know of is constructed pyramidally. Writing is the primary medium. This was the beginning of the 1%. The 1% is not something new. This is where the 1% came from. Armies, and the sole purpose of these pyramids was to acquire more property, more raw materials. That basic model, which was a fluttering experiment 5,000 years ago, now covers the planet. Boom. It's everywhere. Every one of those is a pyramid. This model, it's so ingrained in us, we're not even aware that it exists. So this is where the question for me is civilization's expiration date. And of course, a lot of people thought, like we just watched the movie 2012. It's like it's going to end on that date. I think you want to think of that date much more like the date on your half and half, right? I mean, you can keep the date on your half and half. You can keep drinking the half and half after the expiration date, right? Some of us game that. I can game it up for a week, especially if it's like ultra pasteurized. But there comes a point where it starts to be less and less like half and half, and more disgusting, and eventually it'll make you sick. So I think if you look at the Mayans who came up with this concept about 1,500 years ago, I mean, if I'm throwing darts at a dartboard trying to predict when this model might really become completely unsustainable, December 21st, 2012 is pretty freaking close to the bullseye. And so it doesn't mean it's over. It doesn't mean it's done. It just means it's like that thing, a half and half. It's starting to clot and curdle. So if it was just the Mayan calendar, I wouldn't be as interested. But what really fascinates me is that a number of other spiritual systems are calling for a similar, and again, remember, the Mayan calendar wasn't about the end of the world. It was the end of a cycle, which immediately implies the beginning of the next cycle. But it wasn't just the Mayans, right? Buddha, who is completely uninclined to prophecy, apparently said, although there's some scholarly debate about whether he actually said it, but it was written down a long time ago. He said, 2,500 years after me, there will come a far greater Buddha. Right? I've got hundreds of followers. I'm enlightened. This guy's going to have thousands, millions of followers. It'll surround the planet. And it will, 2,500 years after the Buddha would be right about now. And then, of course, Anne knows all about this because of her sister-in-law. But a lot of conservative Jews, especially Hasidim, are talking about the end times and the coming of the Messiah. I mean, there's one particular Brooklyn group that feels he already lived and died about 10 years ago. But all the conditions are right for the appearance of the Messiah in the Jewish tradition. Go into the Christian tradition, right? A lot of people getting out their book of Revelations, pointing out the correlations. Second coming is coming. Even in Islam, right? Everyone gets all freaked out about ISIS, but a lot of those folks, not defending them in any way, are responding to ancient prophecies about end times. The black flag that they carry, that's what's been prophesied for centuries. The 12th Imam, who will complete the circle, will appear in Syria. And the sign will be Jesus Christ descending over Baghdad, over Damascus. right over a particular mosque in Damascus. So they're working on that system. And finally, if you don't subscribe to any of those, astrologers have been talking about the coming of the age of Aquarius. Again, there's a lot of scholarly debate. Some people think it started in 87. Some people think it isn't coming till 2100. But the bottom line is we're right in the middle of this huge shift from the Piscean age, which started around the time of Christ and ends around now, into this whole new era. So the bottom line is what really interests me is not getting lost in any one of these prophecies, but it's this. 6 entirely different spiritual systems independently predict massive change in world renewal now. That interests me, right? We call that scientific method, right? When independent labs are coming up with the same result. So these guys can't agree on the price of eggs. Half of them won't talk to each other. Half of them don't even know the other ones exist. And yet they've all, from all these different places on the planet, from 2,500 years ago up to now, are all saying, right about now, this is what's supposed to happen. So that's interesting to me. Very interesting. So let's look at the first part, the massive change, right? We're all keenly aware of that. Climate change. Everyone knows about this. And it's already starting to have, in addition to weird weather here, the whole crisis in Syria is a direct result from climate change, right? Worse than normal droughts cause massive immigration into the cities and rising wheat prices, cause social destabilization. Syria falls apart along with the rest of the Middle East. But Syria is now proceeding to destabilize not just the Middle East, but Europe and America. So that's just one area. I mean, the one the Pentagon is really worried about is along the Indian-Pakistani border. They have a huge, even though half the Republicans want to deny climate change, the Pentagon has produced massive books on how climate change is going to impact their plans around the planet, where the most likely destabilization points. The one to really be worried about is the Pakistani-Indian border, because you've got billions of people depending on a couple of river systems whose glacial source is drying up, melting away. So you got that, you get climate change. You also have more immediately peak oil. And again, it's so important. I don't want to get lost in peak oil, but peak oil does not mean running out of oil. We're not anywhere near running out of oil. We're never going to run out of oil. What it means is, in a particular year, you're able to drill the most oil out of the ground you're ever going to get. And after that, you plateau, and then it starts to go down. And the reason this is such an issue is everything in our life depends on oil. First of all, everything in this room is made from petroleum products. Half of what you're wearing is made from petroleum products. Of the food that we eat, for every calorie of food we eat, 9 to 11 calories are from petroleum sources. Fertilizer, pesticides, transportation, harvesting, etc. It's all about, never mind, and the real thing we need to look at is what an incredibly magical power gasoline is, right? The energy in 1 gallon of gasoline, if I were to get on a bicycle, right, a stationary bike attached to an electrical generator and pedaled, it would take me 6 weeks of pedaling 8 hours a day to produce the same amount of energy in 1 gallon of gasoline. That would be like, so I can go buy that gallon of gasoline for $2.40, or I can get on my, and for 240 hours, a penny an hour. That's how much, and just magnify that by, we're pulling 85 million barrels of this out of the ground every single day. So 85 million times. I mean, that's, and what that really means is that each one of us, even if we're just middle class, really have the equivalent of 40 or 50 slaves working for us. That for human beings before the fossil fuel age to live at our standard of living, they would have needed 40 or 50 slaves, even if you're just a middle class American. So our lives are so wound up in this. So the fact that we can't get more, and yet the population is growing, and our economy it's like a shark that has to keep moving. If we don't have 3 to 5% growth every single year, the whole thing implodes. And this is what's given us this incredible growth. So the problem is, this picture does not do justice. You want to really know what peak oil looks like, feels like, smells like? That is peak oil. And again, we're told that all the wrong things about this picture. We draw all the wrong conclusions. This is a picture of what peak oil looks like. First of all, what part of this picture is not dripping in oil? Right? First of all, we have the big fire explosion, right, which boys love oil, right? But buildings, world trade, without oil, doesn't happen. And 9/10 of the guys in that plane were from Saudi Arabia, right? They were trained in madrasas that were funded by petrodollars. Every time you pump the tank, you're paying to educate people to do things like this. That's peak oil. It's all coming to a head, blammo. And again, even more immediate than peak oil, we have unsustainable debt. And this is the elephant in the room that no one's talking about, except for some lunatic Tea Party Republicans. But so these are graphs of world debt, combined world debt. Up to about 1970, when oil production was steadily going up, this is the year the United States hit peak oil. In other words, the United States never was able to drill more oil in any year than this year. And at that point, the debt starts to go up. We hit peak oil on the planet, and it starts to go into a J curve. And then it just goes up and up and up and up. And this is the recession of 2008, right? $26 trillion lost, unemployment, stock market gutted. That is how much of a dip it put in global debt. And this is only from 2015. If I had the pen, this is at 108, we're now at $225 trillion world debt.
Can I ask a quick question? Why is debt connected to that conversion to 1970?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Remember those magical powers that oil has. I can spend 260 hours on my treadmill, or I can pay $2.50 for a gallon of gas. Back then, a gallon of gas was 50 cents. It still would have taken me 240 hours to make that amount of power. If you're always getting, and up to this point, America had always been able to drill more oil every year than the year before. So as long as we're getting more oil, the one thing you could be sure about oil is going up like this, that's what keeps the economy growing. Our whole concept of capitalism and normal economic growth starts in about 1800 with the beginning of fossil fuels, which basically...
Why are they connected? That's what I'm asking.
Because that amount of energy is what enables you to grow things. It's what enables you to build huge buildings and lots of automobiles and transport products all over the world. Otherwise, it's just me sewing the shirt. It's me growing my food. Instead of throwing down a few pennies to play slaves some other part of the world to make them for me. Oil makes everything in our lives happen. And it's so universal, so ubiquitous, we don't even see it. We don't even smell it.
Was it that the demand exceeded the supply?
Precisely.
And
So
that's
the
why
bottom
they
line,
have-
so in other words, America is habituated and addicted to growth. Any of you guys who've been in sales know how it works, right? You have a really good year, you get a pat on your back from your boss and say, that's awesome. No, they want another 10% increase. America lives on growth. If we're not selling more, making more every single year, the whole system falls apart. Because it's all built on debt to begin with, right? So if you're going to get that 5% return on interest, you better have 5% more stuff the next year to cover those costs. And with oil, it's easy. Oil gives me magical powers. I can sit in my chair, trees are cut down, cars travel hundreds of miles, all kinds of things happen with very little effort. Economic growth is very easy if you have fossil fuels. It's like having superpowers. It's like having 7-league boots and a magical carpet and all these superpowers that enables the hero to win in all those stories. If I can't produce more oil next year than I have this year, suddenly it starts to tabletop. And suddenly I don't have 5% growth, I can't make my 5% interest payments. Then the solution is use your credit card, right? We've all been in that situation. Don't have enough inflow, use your credit card. So as soon as we stop having more oil every year, you start to see debt going up. Here's where the world hits peak oil. And then the whole thing is just going in a J curve. And even that little recession there didn't stop the growth. It's continuing to go up here. It's now 225 trillion. And the other really disturbing thing is that much debt wouldn't be a problem if we were making gazillions of dollars. But this is the percentage of GDP that this represents. In other words, here, when we have the crash, the debt, world debt, was 300% of GDP, which basically is like if I make $100 a month, I got a $300 debt. And that's not a problem if it's a 30-year mortgage. But if it's a 5-year mortgage or short-term debt, that's more of a problem. And this is where, basically, it seized up. Debt, world debt in relationship to world income, which is down here, that gap got to the point where it snapped. Now, of course, interest rates here were 5%. Interest rates here are 1%. So it's much easier to sustain that big debt. But the problem is, this is what's terrifying, right? This is debt going up and up and up and up, and it's just continuing to go up. How long is it before you realize it's just a Ponzi scheme? The only thing that's making our sputtering world growth work is increasingly insane levels of debt that will never, ever be paid back. And eventually people will just wake up. It could happen this fall. It could happen in 5 years. It might not happen for 20 years because the incentives to stay in denial are so huge. That is money that can never, ever be paid back. Yes?
But now, is there another way to do it, which if each country forgave each other's debt?
That's the only solution. But suddenly, nothing's worth anything. All your savings disappear. And who's going to pay you to go to work? It all goes away. So absolutely, it's going to have to be forgiven. And I don't want to get too lost in this. What I want to just point out is we're in a state of crisis. So all those spiritual systems we're calling for, things are going to get really hairy, they're getting hairy, right? Obviously, climate change is the worst thing that can happen, but this is the most immediate thing that's going to hit us, is when people wake up to this. Because it's, I mean, 2008, this is the time where you realize we're out of hand. We need to start deleveraging. We need to start paying off our debt. This should be going down. It's going up at the same rate, almost as deeply as it was before. And we've used all the tricks. Obama used a lot of tricks to keep it from crashing. But those tricks aren't available. You can't lower interest rates below zero, right? So the bottom line, and then of course, even the biggest problem to my mind is that we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. Good news is that the world has seen 5 mass extinctions historically. And you'd never guess it to look out the window. So the Earth has a phenomenal ability to regenerate. This whole idea of save the world and the poor Earth, no. She is immortal for our purposes. But who's not immortal is all these other species that our lifestyles are. So normally, a normal extinction rate is 1 to 5 species per year. We're seeing extinction rates of 10,000 species per year. And this future estimate is 30 to 50% of all species that are alive will be dead, gone, extinct by the middle of the century, directly related to our life level.
That means trees, that means plants as well.
Everything, yeah. It's terrifying. And the previous mass extinctions were caused by meteorite hits or volcanic activity. This is basically our addiction to consumption that's doing this. So this, to me, is the worst of all of them, even though the debt thing is the thing that's going to impact us personally in the short term. And of course, climate change is terrifying because it could make the planet unsustainable. So the bottom line is, this is where we're at, right? In this big game that we're playing, it's going on and on and on. Last one standing loses, right? It's an ugly, ugly, ugly. So I don't put a question mark by that. That is civilization's expiration date. We hit it. We're past the expiration date. And it's very dire. Huh? This civilization. But this civilization has a stranglehold on the planet, so it's of some concern. Exactly. So there's a reason to go into despair. And the good news, though, for me, always go to Albert Einstein, it's so comforting. You know? So the significant problems we face today cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were when we created them. And the reason none of the solutions are coming, even though our technology gets faster and faster, and our computers get smaller and smaller, and our weapons get smarter and smarter, and the problems just get bigger and bigger, we're using the same level of thinking. So I know there's been like computer breakthroughs and fossil fuel breakthroughs, but the bottom line is the basic level of thinking that got those pyramids going, with one guy sitting at the top, everyone in terror of him. That's the model. That's the same basic model we're using, and that level of thinking is why we're not solving any of these problems, no matter, even though we throw more, Bill Gates is throwing 3/4 of his fortune at it. It's not getting better. You know, you got some of the smartest people on the planet meeting regularly. It's not getting better. And so it's easy to go into despair or say, we need to go to another level of thinking. And the problem, though, how do we recognize what is that new level of thinking? What the hell? Would we know it if it bit us in the ass, right? So before I answer my view of what that level of thinking is, I think it's helpful to look at previous evolutionary leaps, to like what the previous paradigm was and what the new paradigm is, and what they look like in relationship